so I'm very proud of the effect of that museum after we opened it in 2009, and I think it's having a lasting impact on the state and the nation, and especially in these times, you know, with Charlottesville and so many other challenges that we've got, and of course a president who doesn't seem to believe in the same things that I think we do. So it's important that we continue to teach those lessons. I also ran the Illinois Human Rights Commission, which is the state's civil rights court. So if you get discriminated against because you're a woman who's been sexually harassed, or you're African American, or Latino, or any number of protected classes, and you're fired from a job, or you're not allowed to rent an apartment, or denied any public accommodation, and you deserve justice. And if you can't afford an attorney, you get to go through a process at the state that ends with this court system, this state civil rights court system that I took over. When I took it over, the Republicans had been running state government before that, and I took it over, and honestly, people weren't getting justice. They weren't getting justice swiftly as they should, and they weren't really getting justice. And so people had to wait sometimes 4 years to get their job back after being fired unfairly. And so this commission, which is made up of half Democrats, half Republicans, when I took it over, I worked with the Republicans and the Democrats, and we really changed it, and we made sure that people were getting justice more swiftly, and we really improved the operation of it significantly, and I was proud to have handed it over when I ended my term to a venerable former White House counsel, former judge, former Congressman, Abner Mick. And I felt like that was my reward, you know, that we took this thing that probably nobody wanted when I took it over, and now we had this amazing figure that would carry forward. So I tell you about all these things in the past, and you might say, well, gee, okay, that's great, all the bio, the background, and you know, we want to know what you're going to do for the state of Illinois. But I tell you all that because I think it's important for you when you contemplate all these candidates that stand before you to ask the question, what were they doing before they were running for public office, kind of when nobody was looking, to really change people's lives in Illinois, to make people's lives better? Like, what were they doing? And were they big things that, you know, where you got something big done? Because honestly, we have a lot of big things we need to get done in the state of Illinois, and I think you want somebody who's able to go to Springfield and get things done. And so that's why I talk about my background first, and I want to talk to you about where we need to go in the state and listen to you as well, because boy, we've got some real challenges. But I want to relate how I would solve some of those problems to the things that I've gotten done in the past. That is to say, all those things, you might ask, well, what do these things have in common? There were kids involved in a few of those things, and there's jobs in a few of those things, and there's discrimination that was fighting. So what was it that those things had in common? And I think what those things have in common are really the way that I got them done. And that is, I thought about how do you get these big things done? You don't do it on your own. One person can't do these things. And I think that's something Bruce Rauner has never understood. He went to Springfield and thought he could just order people around and then it would all happen. That's not actually how you get big things done. The way you get big things done is you get the right people in the room. You get elected leaders, yeah, but also community leaders and nonprofit leaders and everyday Illinoisans who care deeply about the issue. And then I set the vision for where it is I think we ought to go. You know, let's build a museum that'll teach kids to fight bigotry and hatred. You know, let's, make sure we expand this school breakfast program. How do we get that done? And when you sit down with other leaders and set a vision for it, provide some leadership, you know, it's funny, people will come to the table with their own ideas about how do we get that done? I have an idea, let me put mine in. And then when you're all done with that process, everybody, including me, you pull on the oar together. And that's how you get it done. And there is too little of that going on in Springfield today. Honestly, we have those big challenges, but you know, when Bruce Rauner sits in his office and tweets that he's waiting for a budget to show up on his desk from the legislature, waiting for a budget? He's the guy who's supposed to initiate the budget process, by the way. And then he sits around waiting with a picture of him sitting at his desk, you know, waiting for somebody to deliver the budget. That's not how you get things done. You got to go in the room with people and work it out, and don't leave until it's done. So we went 2 years and 6 days without a budget. And by the way, when we finally did get a budget, Bruce Rauner had nothing to do with it. There were 10 Republican legislators who finally said, I'm fed up, and I'm crossing over, and I'm going to work with Democrats to try to get a budget done. And they did, to override his veto. By the way, I think every one of those 10 is either retiring or getting challenged by somebody backed by Bruce Rauner. So in some ways, we should applaud those Republicans. And I feel bad for all of them because they're suffering a price for having done the right thing. But we have so much we have to get done. So let's talk about the challenge ahead. I favor, when I think about all the big challenges, jobs, education, healthcare in this state, there's no way you can get anything done in this state unless we change the tax system in the state. A flat tax system is antiquated and outdated. There's very few other states that have a flat tax system anymore. The way a tax system ought to be is the way the federal system is, the way most states are that have income taxes, and that's a progressive income tax. We need to make sure that we're protecting the middle class and people striving to get to the middle class and asking people who can afford to pay a higher rate. That's the way it should work. People who can afford to pay a higher rate. People in the middle class and people striving to get there should pay a lower rate. That's the system we ought to have, but we don't have it in Illinois because we have a constitution from 1970 where somebody thought that was a good idea, and here we sit in 2017 suffering the consequences where we're not able to fund our schools properly. Now let me talk about schools because, I don't want anybody to miss this. Property taxes are very closely related to our tax system at the state level and our schools. That's all related. So when Bruce Rauner says to all of you and everybody else, he wants a property tax freeze, it sounds great because, gosh, property taxes are going through the roof. The problem is you can't say property tax freeze and not say what you're going to do to fund schools. You have to marry these things, or at least you have to tell us what you're going to do about revenue for schools. So I happen to think we should lower property taxes, and the way you do that is have a progressive income tax in the state, and the state steps up to the plate. So again, I want to give you a statistic. About a quarter of all the funding for education in the state of Illinois comes from the state, and the rest, most of it, comes from property tax. So roughly 3/4 from property tax, a quarter from the state. In the average state in the United States, half comes from the state, and half comes from local property taxes. So that's just, we're at the bottom. We're at the very bottom. We're either 49th or 50th in state funding for education. That's just wrong, And so every time they need more revenue, they go back at the state level and they raise the flat income tax. That doesn't seem right to me. And, oh, by the way, at the local level, in order to fund schools, because they're still at only 26% at the state level of funding for schools, they raise local property taxes. So this is a crazy system. We should do away with it, fix it, and properly fund our K-12 schools. I mentioned earlier universal preschool. Important to note. The reason that's so important is it actually ends up saving you money into the K-12 system and in many other ways for the future of the state. And in fact, they say something like there's about a 13% return on every dollar you invest in early childhood. 13% return on investment. 13% return on investment. Most government spending gets you less than $1 back for every dollar that you spend. That's what they say. But on early childhood, there's an enormous return. Multiples on your money over the many years of a child's life, because it turns out if you provide quality childcare and quality preschool, that kids are vastly more likely to graduate from high school and college and get a job. Vastly. And a lot less likely to end up incarcerated. So when you add up all the savings from those things and a few other outcomes that are interesting, by the way, this has all been studied over and over again by researchers. There's nothing that I'm making up here or picking one piece of statistic out of somewhere. This is from across the country, these statistics exist. But there's one other outcome, which is, turns out if you provide quality early childhood education and childcare, kids end up healthier through the course of their lives. It's interesting. So all of those savings inure to the benefit of taxpayers and more importantly, kids do better. So we've got to focus on education, funding education. I'll talk briefly about healthcare and jobs, and then I'll just open it up for questions. I believe that not only do we have to stand up against Donald Trump and be a bulwark against what he's trying to do to our state in healthcare. He's trying to take away healthcare from about 1 million people in the state, and the Republican program would actually raise premiums for people who are remaining, who are actually on a private system or some other system. So people end up paying more, fewer people on health care under the Republican plan, under the Trump plan. We've got to stand up against that. And I believe many of you have been engaged, I bet, in the effort, whether it's sending an email or making a phone call, in standing up against Donald Trump. But in addition to that, we need to find ways to expand healthcare coverage in our state. And so I put forward a plan that would do that. Do you remember that when President Obama introduced the Affordable Care Act, there originally was this idea of a public option. And the idea was that people could buy into a federal system. And it was at a much lower rate because you took the profit motive out of it. Well, we can do that on the state level. We can allow people to buy into the state system. It's about 40% less costly. And so for middle-class families, that's a couple $1,000s back in your pocket. For people who are striving to get to the middle class, it's now an affordable plan. If you're not qualified for Medicaid, it's an affordable plan for those families. So it's called Illinois Cares. This is the program that I put forward. We would be the first in the nation to do it. Although it's been introduced in another state, passed the legislature in another state, the governor, Republican governor, vetoed it in that state. But if we get a Democratic governor here, if I'm your governor, that's a plan I think we can put in day one that will cut costs for people, expand health care coverage, and begin to put us on a path toward universal health care, because that ultimately is what we need, not just for the state of Illinois, but for the country, if you ask me. Last topic, I'll end my soliloquy. Jobs. Look, we had 0.5% job growth in this state last year. That's in the bottom third of job growth in the entire country. This is a businessman, governor, right, who said he was going to create a whole bunch of jobs. He doesn't know how to create jobs. That wasn't the business he was in. Actually, in his business, he fired people to make money. So that's one reason why I think we are in the situation we're in. And also the uncertainty that he's created about, 2 years of no budget. People don't really know where the state's going. How are we going to solve the problems? The rating agencies now rate our debt 50th in the nation. We have the lowest credit rating of any state in the nation. I ran into the guy who's running in New Jersey for governor, and he gave a talk before me at something, and he said, that he was complaining New Jersey is 49th in credit rating, and I got up and said it's only because, you guys would be 50th, but for the fact that we got Bruce Rauner running our state. He's got Chris Christie running his state. But yeah, birds of a feather. So we've got to create jobs in the state, and I want to be clear about something. 2/3 of all the jobs that get created in this state get created by small businesses and startup businesses. And the other third get created by larger businesses. Now, just on the small business point, I put out a plan for this. I really believe that we can help create small new businesses, help small businesses grow. The big problem for small businesses that are in existence today is you can't get a loan from a bank anymore because of the federal rules. It's nearly impossible to grow your business. And by the way, it's hard to grow your business in an environment you don't know what next year looks like in this state. It's very uncertain. So people are holding off investing in growing their small business, and yet that's where many jobs come from. Starting a business is also very hard. And you can't go to a bank and say, I got a plan, would you loan me money on my plan? And so I put together a package that includes not only a state small business loan fund, and not, by the way, that money can be gotten both from a federal program, so we don't have to just find it here in the state of Illinois from state revenues, but we can actually get money from the federal government, and we can have a small, micro loan program, because there are a lot of businesses that can get created for just $25,000. They're service businesses. You don't need to have a storefront for those businesses. So those two things, and then we need technical assistance for people to help them start a business. People who don't know how to navigate the permitting process, or dealing with the state government and all of its bureaucracy. And then finally, mentorship, which is hugely important for people who are starting and growing businesses to avoid the challenges that other people have had in trying to build their business. Very important for us to focus on small businesses, because so many jobs come from there. Then the big businesses. Look, we have a governor who runs around the country, runs around the state, and apparently runs around the globe, bad-mouthing the state of Illinois. That's what he does every single day. And so it's no wonder why lots of businesses don't want to come to Illinois. And you don't want to have a guy running your state who's running it down everywhere that he goes in the world. He went on a trade mission to Asia and criticized the state of Illinois. Aren't you on a trade mission to go try and get jobs in the state of Illinois? So you need somebody who's going to be in the job of governor, who's trying to attract businesses and create jobs in the state, not run it down. And I promise you I'll be your best chief marketing officer for the state of Illinois, because I know something that Bruce Rauner has never said in his life. We've got the most educated, dedicated workforce in the nation. We really have the most important thing that businesses are looking for, because they're not just looking for the lowest priced labor. They're not just looking for the lowest tax rate. That's not the most important thing to businesses. The most important thing to businesses are talented people. That's the most important, and we've got that. And we've got great universities and great community colleges, if only we would fund them, and not let our faculty leave, not let our best kids get up and leave the state because we're not funding our scholarship programs. We need to keep our kids in the state, not just because they're our kids, which is maybe the most important reason, but the other reason is those are our best economic resources for the future of the state. So there's a lot more we could talk about, but I just wanted to touch on the things that I think are core to my campaign, core to the things I think are important for us in the state of Illinois to do to get us back on track and to do better. And it isn't just doing better after 2.5 years of totally failed leadership by a governor, but doing better after decades, really, of neglect of some of the things that I think we all think are most important in the state. So I'll work hard for you. I hope you get a chance to have a good dialogue here today. Thanks for having me. So, any questions? Yes,
okay. I don't know if I'm sure you've been following news about Amazon and the mayor of Chicago offering $2.something billion to Amazon as an incentive to come into Chicago. Okay, we got schools that need that $2.something billion. What is your opinion? Is there a moral issue here? How do you think that we should be handling it?
I'm glad you asked. So, first of all, whatever incentives get provided to any company that's thinking about moving to Illinois, you've got to actually pencil out the math on the question of, is it a good return on investment for the state of Illinois? Are we going to get tax revenues and benefits to the state that outweigh whatever incentives are given? Do I like the idea of giving? If you could get away with giving no incentives, we should do that. That's where I start. Zero, and then.
Amazon why should we even support them?
I agree. The challenge is that we're competing. I don't like it.
Well, why do we compete? Let's just say forget this.
I'll tell you why. Because I'm in agreement with you. I don't like the idea.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I don't like the idea of giving incentives if we don't have to. On the other hand, here's what Amazon is proposing. And we should hold them to it, make sure they don't get any benefits that they're not, for anything that they're not delivering. Agreed with you, because that's not, if it were me, and I think that they're all taking this into account, by the way, they're not getting the benefit unless they deliver. So here's what they say they can deliver, They say they can deliver almost 50,000 jobs at an average wage rate, as I understand, of about $100,000. So if you think about the benefit to the state of creating those jobs, it's pretty big. And the tax revenue that would come from those jobs and from the business here in Illinois would be pretty big. Again, if you don't have to give anything away, you shouldn't. But I do think you have to take into account, the fact that it would be hugely beneficial for the state. I also think, though, that whatever benefits the state gets, once we pencil it out, that you can't just say that, well, the city of Chicago is the only place that benefits from it. That's where all the jobs are going to be, that's where the headquarters is going to be. The city of Chicago is going to do great if we get Amazon, assuming it pencils out. But the benefits that come to the state that you penciled out, the return on investment to the state, should inure to the benefit of the rest of the state too. So, because yes, Chicago is an attractive place as compared to Denver and the other competing cities, Austin, Texas, and so it's an attractive place, and it's why Amazon would come. But then we got a whole state here, and Chicago's an economic engine, but it should in part be an economic engine for the whole state. So that's my view about the Amazon thing, and I favor going after it, but making sure that we're not giving away the store in the process.
I heard something in this maybe 2 years ago, and I could be confused, I'm not sure, but I thought there was an Amazon warehouse out by Joliet where they were actually running a sweatshop. They weren't giving people bathroom breaks. They were working in overheated conditions and working for low salaries. So how do we know that they're not going to run a sweatshop in Chicago?
That's
Well,
not
I know
true.
what they're trying.
That's not
I know
true.
who works there.
My son works for Amazon.
Yeah, that's not true.
But I know what you're asking, and just so that you've got it clear and everybody else has it clear, thank you for clarifying. I have not been to that facility. I'm glad to hear it's not what's been described. But the thing that they're moving to Chicago, that they're looking at Chicago for, is they call it HQ2 because they're actually looking for what they're calling a second headquarters. They're in Seattle today. They have a real problem in Seattle. There isn't enough talent being produced in Seattle, in Washington. They're hiring like 8,000 people a year there, as I understand, and they can't find them. And there aren't enough people moving to Seattle to get enough of the talent. So they've got to do that. So they've got to find a place that's producing a lot of talent. Turns out, not only do we have this diverse economy in Illinois that they can draw from great people, and as I said, and we really do have great people, but we also are producing a lot of talent out of our universities. Chicago happens to be the second largest college town in the nation. I don't know if you knew that. Boston's number one, Chicago's number two. And so that's a very attractive feature, and I'm really glad that we've got that. But it's all over the state, University of Illinois, the community college system, Western, Eastern, SIUE, SIUC. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, I know your first step is to get the Democratic nomination, but assuming you do, what I hate in this country right now is the pitting Republicans against Democrats as the bad word, the bad people. If I'm a Democrat, don't talk to me if you're a Republican. We're all Americans in my opinion, but how are you going to, what is your proposal to handle that mindset that is going on in the state?
Well, I think it begins with dialogue and listening. I don't like the situation that we're in the nation or in the state, where Republicans and Democrats do not talk to one another, and they're constantly lobbing grenades at each other. And of course, we have leaders in Springfield and in Washington today, the governor and the president, who are feeding that. So I am somebody who has demonstrated, I think, in my past, and continue to be somebody like this that works with anybody that's willing to be productive. And look, I have my own progressive values that I hold dear, but I also think you have to listen. And so that means, to me, going to Springfield and making sure that you don't do what I heard Governor Rauner did. I'm going to tell you a quick story. A friend of mine who used to be an elected official in Springfield when you are a former elected official, you're allowed to go on the floor of the House or the Senate anytime you want, just as a former elected. And you're allowed to go in the elevator where the electeds go. He was in the elevator with some Republicans, a Democrat, a friend of mine, Republicans in the elevator. And he was talking to them, he knew them because he had served with them. And they were having a fine conversation, and he said, the elevator doors opened, and in walked Governor Rauner. He walked into the elevator, he didn't say a word to anybody in the elevator, not the 3 Republicans and not the Democratic legislature. Turned around, faced the door, went down one floor, doors opened, he got out of the elevator. My friend said to his 3 Republican friends, gosh, do you guys not talk to one another? And they said, nope, he doesn't talk to us and we don't talk to him. And that's Republicans with Republicans. You can imagine he doesn't talk to any Democrats. So I'm only pointing out that it's very important to listen, to talk across the aisle, to find ways to work together. I mean, listen, I'm for a $15 minimum wage, I'm for raising, for a progressive income tax, I'm for a lot of, for making sure we're funding our schools, expanding healthcare. And if there are Republicans that are willing to step up and be part of that agenda, that's great. I'm guessing there aren't too many today, but I'm hoping we could bring some along. I'm for the Equal Rights Amendment. I think we got to pass that. And I will tell you, at least by virtue of what I just heard on the way here, there's not a single Republican that is willing to vote today for the Equal Rights Amendment. Can you imagine that?
They're trying to take more of our rights away from us.
Right.
But they're trying to take us back to the 50s. What did I fight for in the 60s?
Exactly.
What did I fight for? I mean, it's absolutely, my husband just lost his job after 26 years, and he could be working at Amazon.
Right.
This is, a brilliant man. So what have we been fighting for all these years? They're taking us back, and it's so frustrating.
It is, and on that topic, by the way, I know Governor Rauner is, finally agreed to sign HB 40. I want to tell you all, it took us months and months and months. The sponsors, the House sponsor, the Senate sponsor of HB 40 are both very close to me, supporting my campaign. I was very involved in doing a letter writing campaign, a postcard campaign, online, getting people to call the governor's office to make sure that he changed his mind, which he finally did. But his original stance was he was going to veto HB 40. And so between
But back when he was running, he said he was pro-choice.
he said it, and then he got in.
Flip-flop,
Yeah, exactly. And I think the question is, can you trust him on anything?
No, I don't trust any of them, to be honest with you. If they have an R by their name. So.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Pritzker, I'm Nikki Serbin. I'm part of the Frankfort Township Democrats, Illinois Democrats. Helped my friend Amanda run for Will County Board. I had the pleasure of hearing you down in Springfield, as well as in Joliet. I love that you're for progressive tax. I love that you're for $15 minimum wage. Another one that's near and dear to me is cannabis legalization. Not just because it affects reform and criminal reform, not just because it affects agriculture, because you can produce an acre of hemp and it can be the same good as an acre of woods in terms of acre production. We're a farm state. We could do tourism in Cairo and Shanahan and Chicago all the same. In Colorado last year in tax revenue, they brought in $1 billion. They brought in $77.1 billion in tourism revenue. So that directly affects people here. A lot of people think that drugs, they kind of tie them together. Cannabis has been shown in states where recreational drugs are legal, recreational cannabis is legalized. Opioid overdoses are down by 25%. It curbs dope sickness. It makes it a lot easier for people to come off those really hard drugs. So it's something that's important to me. Obviously, we see that as medical value, so it shouldn't be a Schedule I, though that's outside your purview. I'd like to make sure that you see the benefits, because you're never going to convince me it's more harmful than alcohol. You're never going to convince me if I've got a shared company with people indulging in one or the other, I can tell you whose company I would prefer. Though I imagine the snacks would be better too. But it's one of those things where I feel like there's a lot of common sense things that can be done. I don't think it should be kind of a free-for-all thing. I don't think that should open the door to everything. But I think the days of reefer madness should be put to bed.
agree with most of that. I'm in favor of legalizing, but three quick, comments about it. One is because it's so readily available already. I mean, truly it is. And because it's readily available but not regulated and can be unsafe. I think we should regulate it, make it safe. So that's one reason. The second, you mentioned criminal justice reform, and people shouldn't be in prison or, because they've got a small amount of marijuana. And we've got bigger fish to fry, so to speak, in the world. And then the third is of course the estimates in the first or second year are $350 to $700 million of revenue for the state of Illinois. I don't want that to be the driver.
Well, I just drive the point home that we are a desert. We're in cannabis desert, so they do a lot in Vegas and Colorado, and that's great. But we've got people leaving the state. It would bring people back to the state, not just to visit, but to reside.
We should legalize the tax.
Help the taxes
Regulate.
too, we have a tax, we're in debt, the state's in debt.
Oh, yeah, I mean.
States that have legalized marijuana for recreational purposes have climbed out of debt.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to do that. I'm in favor of it. I've been in favor of it. I didn't just come to this. So, and by the way, Heather Staines, who also happened to be the HB 40 sponsor in the Senate and is a friend of mine, is also the sponsor of the bill to legalize it, and it's a good supporter of mine. So, yes, ma'am.
I think he had a question.
Okay, yes, yes.
Well, it also
Thank you.
provides, a couple of points, it provides, well, first of all, a huge amount of money is spent incarcerating drug users. But it also provides a cash crop replacement essentially for the ethanol corn, which is an environmental nightmare. It's more energy to produce the stuff than it saves in the end. So they've got an automatic built-in replacement in terms of a cash crop.
We have about 10 minutes. I want to get to the last question, so Laura and then Kathy and then Jackie for time.
Hello, I'm Laura Hartnett, suburban mom, small business owner. I've been in and out of activism for 26 years to varying degrees depending on the stages of my children's lives and my volunteerism. I'm going to be candid with you, I'm a progressive. I have one toe in the DNC tent right now.
Right.
Of course, the DNC embraces my ideology more than the RNC. I see the divide you address. I see all of these core issues. The problems that I'm seeing is the Amazon conversation ties into the billionaire conversation. We are forced as an RNC and a DNC to accept two choices: oligarchs, wealthy people, and people that run the tent. I will admit to you, I came here prepared to give you a newspaper rundown. The Sun-Times, you're very effacing. Thank you so much for coming to speak. I feel so much better.
Thank you.
But I need to be candid. There are grassroots progressives that hit the pavement, and if they love you, they're going to hit the pavement hard. But that money in politics is holding us back.
It's a problem. So let me address that question. You can imagine that question has come up.
Sure.
And I think it's important for me to say to you, this race is about values. It's not about money. It shouldn't be about money.
Then can I interject and say, sorry to be rude,
Yeah.
but my reason that I was upset in the first place was that I read extensively, and the Blagojevich calls, and the property tax savings by purchasing properties. Those are the very things that I want out of politics.
Right, so let me just say, I believe that core progressive democratic values are what we ought to be fighting for in this state. I mean, that is, there's no doubt about it, that we've strayed away from that. And by the way, there are many people within the Democratic Party that don't share that view.
Fully.
And so we've got to restore that, because I believe that that's, if you think about the history of the Democratic Party going back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and all the way to today, the history, the core, the reason that my parents were Democrats, the reason that I'm a Democrat is because we fight for working families, we fight for those who are striving to get into the middle class, and then we've got a whole big bunch of issues that are important to all, I think all of us, around civil rights, around standing up for people's individual rights, about standing up for women's health, making sure we have universal health care. That's been an issue since, forever, and it's time. And so you've got to, in my view, you've got to elect somebody who's actually done big things and is able to go to Springfield, do big things, because it's easy to say these things. It's just easy for candidates to stand up and say them. It's hard to get them done. And that's what I'm suggesting to you, that what you ought to ask about all the candidates, because standing up in front of you and telling you they're for a progressive income tax, when we know it's hard to do, it's really hard to do. Because you've got to go elect others, by the way, because there aren't enough votes today. You've got to help elect other progressive Democrats in order to get it done. Those are all things that we've got to, those are big things. You know, just getting elected and saying the things is one thing. Getting elected and actually doing them is another. That's what I'm suggesting is the difference between all the other candidates and me. And to the point you're raising, listen, Citizens United is one of the worst decisions that's ever been made by the Supreme Court, ever. It has changed the face of politics in the country. I am not the one who started out in December of 2016 and wrote a $50 million check into his own campaign account. That was Bruce Rauner. And I hate to tell you, but over the last, so what I did as a kid was knock on doors for progressive Democrats with my mother. And good, I'm glad to know that. Well, I hate to tell you, you're gonna end up here someday then. But at 11 years old, knocking on doors, licking stamps and envelopes back when we did that, now you can push a button. But those things are the core things about how we Democrats, knocking on doors, identifying our voters, getting them out to vote. Those are the core things that we Democrats do to get out our voters and talk about the issues at the door that are core to working families and people striving to get there. They're core progressive issues, the things that I've articulated, I think, today to you.
Yes, I feel you're very progressive. I think I'm speaking to the larger.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I'm just saying, and so here, look, you've noticed, I have not attacked or said anything mean at all in commercials or standing in front of you or anywhere else about my opponents in the Democratic primary. All I'm doing is trying to tell you who I am. I started out in a race where there's another famous person that's running in the primary here. I needed to make sure that people know what I stand for. And so that's what I've tried to do throughout this campaign. And do another thing, which is I'm simultaneously running a campaign against Bruce Rauner. Because we have to beat Bruce Rauner. I know, I'm sorry. I know it's been a couple minutes.
I'm a retired teacher, so I was in the pension issue interesting. Could you give me your elevator pitch on
Sure.
the pension?
Yes, and it will be an elevator pitch because we have time constraint. First of all, state workers, teachers, public servants, for the most part, teachers and state workers and police and fire and so on are not getting overpaid. In fact, teachers, generally speaking, are adequately or slightly less than adequately paid. And the deal when you get the job is you get the pension. That's the deal. You shook on that, figuratively speaking. You shook on that deal when you took the job, right? And they shook on the deal. And now, Bruce Rauner wants to, at the very end, I don't know what your age is, but I mean, people who are at retirement age, right, are now.
It never ends.
I didn't, but at retirement age, are now being told, I'm sorry, we're going to take some of that away from you, and that somehow you got to make up for it. I mean, literally, it's just not fair. It's not right. The deal was the deal. You've got to live up to the obligation that was made. We, the state, needs to live up to the obligation. We can do it. We actually, in order to get that to happen, you've got to step up the payments into the system now. Not wait for it to go like this, because that's what it's doing, but rather step up the payments now and then even it out over time. And you can do that. I mean, this is literally just a financial problem that you can solve. You could step up the payments and flatten out. You have to do that, by the way, because otherwise you can't budget the budget of the state. You can't write the budget of the state if pension payments are going like this. You have to know what they are going into the future so you can budget them properly. So that's, I guess, the core answer. There's a lot of other, detail that goes behind it, but I know we don't have time. But just suffice to say, I believe we need to stand up for the pensions that were promised to me. Yes.
Hi.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Jackie, Precinct Committee Chairman for Precinct 20 here in Frankfort Square. Talk about running around and knocking doors, and these boots used to have heels. I mean, it's a lot of work, and we're ready to hit the pavement to do good things. But instead of asking my question, I am going to yield the floor to my committee, somebody who's in my district, who's a young man who has
Young
a
man,
question, then
good.
it's important for our youth people to have a.
How old are you, by the way?
11.
11, all right, perfect, yeah.
I've done a lot of work for the homeless, and I was wondering what you were going to do to help the homeless.
Good question, Nathan.
It's a great question. I'm so glad to hear it. By the way, do you help you work at a shelter? Or?
Yeah.
You do. Good for you. Good for you. And good for you. So there are two answers I want to give you. One is just so you understand what the current governor did by not passing a budget, by not introducing a budget ever. All the funding across the board for mental health facilities, for shelters, for human services that people really need. And homeless shelters are a really good example of just a basic need.
That serve a disproportionate amount of veterans.
Indeed, and all those services were diminished, cut, many shelters closed, people who worked there had to be fired, and honestly, that's not easy to replace or replenish. So what he's done is feels like a permanent effect, or at least near term, it feels permanent, unless you get somebody in the office who believes in building back up our human services. I think you don't maybe know what this is, but I hope you'll take a U.S. history class. Do you know what the Marshall Plan was? So for anybody who doesn't, anyway, it was rebuilding Europe after World War II. It was the United States stepping in and rebuilding Europe after World War II. The Marshall Plan was a big thing that needed to get done, and it was the right thing to do. We need a Marshall Plan for our human services in this state. So, but homeless shelters, and I too have volunteered at homeless shelters, so I know that homeless shelters are just the very, very beginning of that process, because there are services that people who are at those shelters need every day. I mean, there are services that they need. Veterans, we were talking about veterans, the services that are owed to the people who have stood up for all of us are large. I mean, we owe a big debt to them, and we cannot fail. And so starting with housing, although homeless shelter is just the beginning of housing, and making sure food, clothing, shelter, and then the services, mental health facilities, and making sure that those veterans are cared for, is very important to me. So I've been engaged in that in a variety of ways over many years, but I just want you to know what you do as a volunteer means a lot to each person that you engage with at those shelters. Just so you're making a big difference for them. And I want to help make a difference too, and help you make a difference by making sure we fund our services.
He was all in. I wanted to say thank you so much for coming out. I think we learned a lot. It was great. And I do want to do one more plug for drinks and hot dogs. Let's show our appreciation to the VFW. They did allow us to come in and take up their space for over an hour. And then I have lots of flair in the back as well, if you're interested in that. But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.